Thank you very much for attending the 18th Annual Bentley Lecture in Sustainable Agriculture. I hope you've enjoyed the posters outside. I would like to welcome you all. My name is Robert Grant. I'm the academic chair for this presentation. I would like to have you all know that the University of Alberta acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to enrich our vibrant community. Okay, I'd like to welcome all the sponsors. The sponsors for our program here are Alberta Canola Producers Commission, the Alberta Institute of Agrologists, the Alberta Wheat Commission, Corteva Agriscience, and Nutrien Feeding the Future. Our sponsors. Thank you very much. I welcome all staff, students, and alumni and guests who are attending today. I would just like to take a second to recap to recall that Dr. Fred Bentley, to whom this event has been named in honor of. Dr. Bentley got his BSc in agriculture in 1939, his master's in soil science in 1942 from the University of Alberta. He got his PhD in soil science from the University of Minnesota in 1945. He was dean of the faculty from 1959 to 1968. And his work focused on soil fertility and nutrient quality, so that the lectures that we have here reminisce about his work here and build upon that work. In 2008, he was awarded the university's most prestigious honor, the U of A Distinguished Alumni Award, which recognizes graduates whose truly outstanding achievement have earned them national or international prominence. Fred, of course, has also won several other major environmental awards, and he's certainly one of the key figures that have come out of this faculty. All right, I'd like to introduce Dr. Stan Blade, Dean of our faculty, Agriculture, Life, and Environmental Sciences, who will bring greetings and updates.
Very good. Thank you very much, Dr. Grant. Welcome all. It's great to have you here. Welcome to the 18th Bentley Lecture in Sustainable Agriculture. To show how efficient we are also celebrating, what are we celebrating today? Canada's Agriculture Day. So this is, we've got it all covered in one fell swoop. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Her Honor, the Lieutenant Governor. Lois Hole is an accomplished businesswoman, a proud long-standing. Lois Mitchell, I've said it again. Her Honor will also know that this is not the first time that I've done that. It's a remarkable show of my advancing years at this moment, so do not be alarmed by all of this. Thank you, Your Honor. Let's just touch base on just a few of the remarkable accomplishments of Her Honor. An accomplished businesswoman, a proud long-standing member of Alberta's dedicated corps of community volunteers, has been so active, named as Lieutenant Governor in 2015. In the business community, she started Amherst Consultants. She was a founding partner of Rainmaker Global Business Development. She's been on the board of UBS Bank here in Canada. And she's also played a role in so many other public agencies, as a board member of MyTax, as a director of the Hockey Canada Foundation. Just this remarkable record of so many activities. I have the proud honor of being on the Alberta Order of Excellence Council, where Her Honor is Chancellor, and which just provides such remarkable leadership. And in 2012, Her Honor was awarded the Order of Canada. So without further ado, and before I make any other slip-ups, please help me in welcoming Her Honor, Lois Mitchell.
I just want to say a good afternoon to everyone. It is a privilege to be here. I was trying to tell Stan that basically I started out this wonderful day by being first with people from Barhead, and then with Fort Saskatchewan. I just came in from Fort Saskatchewan, where I can truly tell you I appreciate the wonderful people of Alberta. But I also have a whole new, I would tell you, passion. It's agriculture. It is absolutely my passion. I actually got to open.
Here, here.
2 weeks ago, I was able to open the 8 cities that are either Board of Trade or Chambers of Commerce joined together that are doing things in Canada. And the city of Calgary, they happen to be the Chamber of Commerce in Calgary, had the first agricultural summit, and I got to open it. And I stayed the whole day. I can tell you how much I learned was unbelievable. And then from there, I just have to say it. It's okay, Stan. U of C also has under the School of Public Policy, a good friend of mine, John Simpson. He cared deeply about it. He has 1,000 head of cattle on his ranch. And so he gave, and all I care about is this wonderful collaboration that's going on in Alberta. And I guess it's okay to say thank you to our guest speaker. I hate to tell you that I'm a UBC graduate, so. First of all, I just want to say, I think it is amazing. Stan, don't tell Stan, we don't want him to get a big head, but I do love working with this amazing dean. And when I first became the lieutenant governor, he had held me over, you know how that, you introduced me to this amazing faculty, and I have been absolutely amazed at the great work that's gone on. But don't tell Stan that, we don't want him to have a big head, that's all there is to it. Thank you to Robert for acknowledging that we are on treaty, I have to say, 6 territory. I do want you to know that I do a great deal. I have to tell you, with our Indigenous people, the first time we've ever had the Lieutenant Governor Arts Awards, we had the Mascachis. I do a great deal with many, I have to tell you, of the wonderful Indigenous people, a lot. I have great respect for them. I learn a lot. I now try and do everything in the round. That's how it's what they've taught me. You learn so many things from being with them. I can't begin, and also a lot to do with agriculture, let's face it. Okay, I'm not gonna say very much because I really, I just wanna say that I know and understand the sustainability of the air, the water, and the land that we all rely on as global citizens, because that's the one thing that I truly am beginning to understand how important our role is as global citizens. It's one of the most pressing topics, I think, when you think of the sustainability that's going on, that we all have to talk about and care about. It's a challenge that extends beyond geographic borders, and that's why I love that we are celebrating, I have to say, Canada Agriculture Day, and good for you, for bringing this wonderful group together that care, and that's what it's all about. It starts with caring and being able to share a good message. And the one thing I have learned is about sharing the messages that as much as I have to tell you this, I'm going out to tell those people of Vancouver, where I grew up, that the Port of Vancouver is not theirs, it belongs to Canada. And that's what I preach, believe me. I just want to say that we know that transformational ideas are rarely created in a vacuum. Rarely created in a vacuum. They're the result of people coming together, like you people here, to learn from one another and encourage each other to deliver the best of their energy, their creativity, and their expertise. And I will tell you, I am proud. Stan and his team at the Faculty of Agriculture, Life, and Environmental Science is a great example of that. And I've watched it, Stan, and I don't want you to get a swell head, because if you do, next time you call me by the wrong name. So, as Her Majesty, that's the whole thing, by the way. The best job I have in the whole world, I have one boss, Her Majesty. That's true, the Queen. So I want you to know that as Her Majesty, the Queen's representative, it is my really great pleasure to thank everyone here who is focusing on this incredible, amazing, and essential topic. I do want to recognize Navin. I'm very excited to hear what you have to share with all of us. I think this is wonderful, and I do think we have to continue, especially in Alberta, to work with these people in BC and get the right message across, right? Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Your Honor. I know this will be hard for you to believe, but sometimes you really have to work hard to tease out the opinions of the Honorable Lois Mitchell. So thank you very much for attending and participating. I will just give you a very short summary. As you probably worked out, we're doing this particular Bentley lecture a little differently than we've done in the past. What we will do, and you've already participated in the poster session outside, we'll have this great lecture, and then you're all welcome to come back to a more extended reception. The same posters that you've seen outside, by pure magic, are going to show up in our Agriculture and Forestry Center over just in behind the Student Union building. So you're all welcome to come back. Through the gracious support of our sponsors, there's a great reception. And really the change in some ways is that rather than inviting a much smaller group to a dinner for the Bentley lecture, we want to have all of you at that reception interacting. So please keep that in the back of your mind. Of course, you're all welcome to this particular event. Always dangerous to do this. We're glad that sponsors are here, that alumni are here, so many of our partners and supporters. But if you're a student from Olds College, could you yell or put up your hand or do something like that? Very good. Welcome our friends from Olds College. We have a great relationship with so many of our partner institutions across the province. Certainly our friends from Lakeland and Vermilion are going to come as well. Again, I don't know if you've noticed, but the weather is just a touch off for making that kind of a trip. So we really appreciate the fact that the Olds College students came out. So I'll just give you a sense of our faculty at this moment. This year we have about 1,600 undergraduate students, about 300 of those international students, so coming from all over the world. We have almost 600 graduate students. Of the master's students, 2/3 of those are women. So it's an interesting way in the way that our gender balance is changing, particularly within our postgraduate training. And we've had just all kinds of interesting things happening over the past several months. We've been able to hire someone, again with the support of a number of people in the room here. The Western Grains Research Foundation has supported a chair in cropping systems. Dr. Linda Gorham has now taken on that role. We have an activity around agricultural entomology. Dr. Boyd Murray has been recruited, and that has been supported by our great friends at the Alberta Canola Producers, at Alberta Pulse, at Alberta Barley, the Alberta Wheat Commission, which we're very grateful for. So to have these 3 new people, because we also found a position with respect to all things soil health, plants, microbes, soil. So to have those new people coming into our faculty has been very helpful. We have Dr. Shofang Wang, someone that is working very closely with Stephen Strelkov in the continuing difficulties that we face around clubroot to do the research that's required there. Renewable resources, it's an exciting year. This is the 50th anniversary of our forestry program. So you'll see a whole array of activities. A calendar has already been produced. Dr. McDonald, who I will introduce in a moment or two, alongside of Cynthia Strawson, if you want to show your hand, working a lot with all of the celebration around that 50th anniversary of the beginning of the forestry program. And I really have to identify, in addition to a number of other great things, Charles Knock has just joined Renewable Resources as an ecosystem-based forestry individual, a new professor within our ranks. But I think in this case, most importantly, Dr. McDonald, the chair of Renewable Resources, was the recipient of the highest academic award of this university, the University Cup. So I think a round of applause for Dr. McDonald. So impossible to just pick and choose a little bit, but we've had these great things from our Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology. Mackenzie Martin came second in our 3-minute thesis, the idea of actually presenting the work that you're doing as a graduate student in a very constrained time frame. Coming up at the end of March, our human ecology group will be putting on another annual lecture, the MP lecture, and indeed one of our colleagues, Dr. Carla Prado, is going to talk about nutrition, body composition. So if you have an interest in those kinds of activities, I would certainly recommend or suggest that you participate. Next week is Reading Week. Some students may know that. We have over 100 of our students participating in mini internships. So these are our undergraduates that are going to be going out either to the farms of top producers, to companies that are involved in food and all other kinds of value-added processing, because we know that we need to get our students as closely connected to the potential opportunities that they will have once they graduate from this institution and from our programs. So a great deal of activity in practicums and others, but this is a very special area that Dr. Frank Robinson has been very involved with, to just get our students talking to some of the key people in the various industries that they are involved in. Lots of exciting things going on at our garden. If you were there for Luminaria, you will know that we're building a new visitor center. We certainly anticipate the building of a new pavilion, the divan, that will also fit with everything that's going on at the Aga Khan garden, in addition to all the other beautiful pieces of the puzzle at the garden itself. And of course, as a faculty, just like this lecture, we think about how we can make contact with citizens of Alberta and beyond, whether it's the Banff Pork Seminar that is held when 1,000 people come across, where our colleagues in AFNS play such a key role, the Dairy Seminar, a whole array of other kinds of activities. We want to make sure that everybody from K to 12 to people in your age category, which is slightly more than K to 12, I would wager, has the kind of understanding, that kind of knowledge transfer of all the cool things that are going on within our industries. So it's an exciting time for the kinds of things that we're doing within our faculty. We had successfully come through the celebration in 2019 of 100 years of teaching soil science, 90 years of our Breton plots, and much of that was coordinated by the department chair that I've already introduced, and I will ask Dr. Ellen McDonald to come and introduce our speaker. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, Dan. Just to follow in on the 100th anniversary of soil science and 90th anniversary of the Breton plots, there's still some of these limited edition collector's t-shirts available, and they will be for sale along with some mugs. I think Dick has a few Breton plot mugs, so if you come to the reception afterwards, you can pick one up. Okay, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Navin Ramankutty. Got his BSc in Mechanical Engineering at the PSG College of Technology in India. And then I would say, I think he saw the light and switched fields into starting to study climate sensitivity, where he got a Master's of Science in Atmospheric Science from the University of Illinois. Then his interest further evolved into relationships between climate and land use, and he went on to earn a PhD in land resources at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And coincidentally there, he met another PhD student who became his wife, and she actually was a former master's student of mine. So we have a connection there. Then he went into a position as a research scientist at the Nelson Institute for Sustainability, Nelson Institute Center for Sustainability and the Global Environment at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Subsequently went to McGill in geography as an assistant professor, and then UBC got smart and recruited him and his wife out to UBC, where Navin is a Tier 1 Canada research chair and professor of global food security and sustainability. So he has a position in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, and he's also associated with the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability, as well as the new Institute for Global Issues. And his interests encompass human land use, global environmental change, and food security, which seems to be an excellent fit for the Bentley Lecture in Sustainable Agriculture. So I'm very much looking forward to Navin's talk. Please join me in welcoming you.
Thank you, Ellen, for that warm introduction. I'm delighted to be here in Edmonton, where as Ellen mentioned, where my wife grew up, and at the University of Alberta, where, in addition to my wife doing her master's degree, my father-in-law taught math until his retirement. So I've actually spent all too many cold Christmases here in Edmonton. It's a little bit like homecoming. I'm also delighted to be invited to give the 18th Bentley Lecture, and thank you, Your Honor, for being here. I'm really flattered and graced by your presence. Reading Dr. Fred Bentley's biography was really humbling. He's done some incredible amount of development work, international development work around the world, including in India, the country where I grew up. And I was really delighted to have lunch with his daughter this afternoon, Anne Bentley, and have amazing conversations. Thank you. I was also really, I had really engaging conversations with a lot of you today and realized the amount of depth of knowledge that a lot of you have here was quite humbling. As Ellen mentioned, I'm trained as a climate scientist and later kind of an ecosystem modeler. And so I really have a 10,000 foot view of the world. And that's what I'm going to do today. But the depth of knowledge that you folks have really was enriching today. So thank you for that as well. With that, I'd like to start with this image, which was taken by a friend of mine in the Philippines. This is the Ifugao rice terrace paddies. And it's a World Heritage Site now. These paddies were hand-carved by humans more than 2,000 years ago, way before we had fossil fuels, way before we had tractors and so on. So it's a testimony to the fact that humans have been transforming the landscape on a very large scale and have done so for a very long time. And if you zoom in and look at what's happened over the last 300 years, this is an animation that will show you how croplands in the world have changed over the last 300 years, starting in 1700s. As I run through the animation, I want you to pay attention to a few things. One, you'll see that in the 1700s, there wasn't very much large-scale cultivation in the New World. And you'll see initially cultivation along the eastern seaboard of North America and migrating westward with time. You'll also see cultivation emerging in sort of the new frontiers in Australia, Argentina, and over the last 50 years, you'll see a lot of expansion in Brazil. Start to see westward migration with time. You start to see cultivation here in Australia, in the Pampas. And more recently in the Amazon. And the rest of the world, of course, has been intensifying its agriculture over time. And so this is the picture of the world we have today. And in this image, which we reconstructed using a combination of kind of satellite imagery as well as ground-based information, shows cultivated lands, croplands in greenish colors, and in kind of this reddish brownish colors are grazing lands, places where we have our animals. So fully a third of the world's landscapes now is covered in agriculture. And you really think about that, that's a huge footprint. We are just one species on this planet, and we are using a third of our lands to grow food. And it's a good thing too, we are producing food. But that's not the only story. The other side of the story, the other side of the coin is that we have also been intensifying our food production, especially in the last 50 to 60 years since the Green Revolution, through using mechanization, irrigation, and fertilizer use. So if you look at what's happened over just the last 40 to 50 years, since 1960, populations have doubled since 1960, but food production has more than kept pace with the rise in population. How has that happened? It's not because of expansion of agricultural area. Harvested area has actually only increased by about 20%. It's because we have increased our intensification of the land. Irrigated areas more than doubled over the same time period, and fertilizer use has quadrupled over this time period. And in fact, today, calories per person, we produce more calories per person today, nearly 3,000 calories per person compared to 1960s. If this were distributed equally around the planet, we wouldn't have any hunger at all. And while populations increased from about 5.5 to 7.5 billion people, the number of undernourished people has actually decreased from about 1 billion to about 800 million today. So this is a huge success story, that while the number of people on this planet increased, we've actually produced more calories, we've reduced undernourishment over the same time period. And it's also agriculture. It's not just about feeding feeding people. It's also about providing jobs. It provides a critical source of livelihood for many people around this planet still, for 1 in 3 people, and especially important for the poor. 3/4 of the poor rely on agriculture for their jobs. In Africa, it's 2/3 of the workforce is in agriculture, and it contributes to 1/3 of the GDP. So in some ways, you can argue that agriculture is the foundation of human civilizations. Our population numbers probably wouldn't have grown this high if we hadn't kept up with producing food. But we have still a lot of challenges. The problem has not gone away. We still have challenges in terms of food security. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa today, even though we have 300 calories per person globally on average, places in sub-Saharan Africa still have undernourishment rates. This is just not having enough food of 35% or above. And at the same time, you look into the future, the number of people is only going up, estimated to go up to 9 or 10 billion people. And as consumption also goes up, people estimate that we'll have to increase the amount of food produced, the demand, by about 2 times. And on top of this, we have kind of looming environmental challenges. Some of it is related to agricultural production as well. If you take a kind of catalog of global environmental problems and ask, what's the role of agriculture in this? Turns out that for biodiversity loss, agriculture happens to be the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. But for birds, for which we have really good data, about 60% of the threats to birds is because of farming, because of habitat loss. It's the biggest consumer of water on the planet, 85% of consumptive use. It's the biggest polluter of water on the planet in terms of causing dead zones around the planet because of excess nitrogen and phosphorus running off. It also contributes to climate change. It's estimated that about 1/4 of our greenhouse gas emissions of our climate impact comes from agriculture. And the focus of my talk is going to be on this last piece. And so I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that. So the reason agriculture contributes to climate change is partly because of tropical deforestation, which is happening today in Brazil and Indonesia mostly. And that releases carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas. But our livestock and rice paddy cultivation also releases methane emissions. Methane is a more powerful greenhouse gas. And our use of fertilizer on the planet causes nitrous oxide emissions, which is a even more powerful greenhouse gas. So about 50% of, about 10% of CO2 emissions, 50% of methane emissions, and nearly 3/4 of nitrous oxide emissions come from our land use practices in farming, altogether contributing to about 1/4 of total climate impact. So I've talked so far about how agriculture contributes to climate change. Agriculture is a contributor. But agriculture is a unique sector. Forestry is the only other one I can think of, where agriculture is actually both a contributor to climate change, but simultaneously it also is impacted by climate change. It's a victim of climate change. And finally, it can also be a solution of climate change. So it's a really interesting sector in the sense that, and I like to look forward and ask, how can agriculture become a solution? Most of my talk, I'm going to, remaining part of my talk, I'm going to focus on climate impacts on agriculture and what we can do about it. But finally, I think we should start moving towards, agriculture as a solution to feeding people, but also dealing with climate change. For my talk, because I have only 45 minutes, I'm going to focus on only crops. I'm not going to talk about livestock or fish or aquaculture or things like that. I'm also going to talk about, at the global scale, talk about studies that are the 10,000 foot view, so to speak. There are a lot of people here who know a lot more about what might happen in Alberta or the rest of Canada. Okay, so how do we think agriculture will impact climate change? And we can start going back to the basics and go back to the leaf level and talk about photosynthesis. So this is the basic photosynthesis equation that most of you probably know already. Carbon dioxide and water mix together and form carbohydrates. That's the photosynthesis equation. Light provides energy for this equation to happen. And this chemical reaction, the rate of that chemical reaction is determined by temperature. So essentially, you know that plants need carbon dioxide. That's what they're fixing to form food. They need water, they need light, and they are affected by temperature. Okay? So if you, just starting from this basic knowledge of how plants fix carbon dioxide, you can make some guesses about how we think agriculture will be affected by climate change. So we kind of might expect that warmer regions will actually face some heat stress. As temperatures get warmer in the tropics, for example, we might imagine that crops might fail because it's too hot for them. But we might actually imagine that colder regions may actually benefit because we may have fewer frosts, we might have longer growing season, and so places like Canada or Russia might actually benefit from climate change in terms of their agriculture. Almost all regions are probably going to see more water stress, and this is because as climate changes, one thing that we observe is that temperatures go up pretty much everywhere, but rainfall patterns are not very clear. So rainfall might go up or go down. There's not a lot of agreement on what might happen. But put those two together, that as temperatures go up, typically it means it increases the amount of evaporation from the land surface, what people call evapotranspiration. That makes the soil even drier. So no matter what happens to rainfall, we typically expect things to get drier on the planet. We also know that CO2 is good for plants and that increasing the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere might benefit plants, but there are different kinds of plants. There are C3 and C4 plants, and we expect that C3 plants, I'm not going to go into details, will actually benefit from increasing CO2. So wheat will probably benefit, but maybe not maize because they're two different types of crops. And then finally, there's an unknown, which is we don't know a lot about how, it's not enough to know what will happen to crops, how crops will respond to climate change. We have to know how the things that compete with crops will respond to climate change. So we have to know what will happen to pests and weeds and things like that. Okay, so now I'm going to sort of cover what the literature shows so far on what we know about climate change in agriculture. Let's just first look at what's happened over the last 30, 40 years. This is showing the amount of warming over cultivated areas of the world. And you can see that pretty much everywhere, except a few places, it's been warming. And these numbers are saying that the rate of warming over this time period from 1980 to 2008 is about 3 times larger than the historical kind of standard deviation of temperature. Okay? With rainfall, as I said, it's not as clear. Some places it's getting warmer, drier, and some places it's getting wetter. So then you can say, okay, we have this kind of information over time. We have, we have historical data on climate and weather. We have historical data on yields. We have models. So what scientists are trying to do is to take this information and trying to make sense of what the future might look like. So today there are kind of 4 different kinds of methods that people have been using, depending on what kinds of skills you have. Some people use statistical models where they basically say, we have historical information on weather and yields, let's develop a relationship and let's use that to try to project into the future. Others think that we need to use crop models, and there are essentially 2 different kinds of crop models. There are farm level models, models that are highly calibrated to a single farm, and then you can use those models and run them in other places and see what they say. There are also now, more recently, these global kind of gridded models. These are kind of just like we have global climate models, people have started developing global crop models that cover the entire planet. And then finally, there are a few kind of soil warming experiments where people take a particular farm and they artificially try to warm the soil and look at what happens to yields. So I won't have a time to cover all of them, but I'm going to try to give a general sense of what do we know about how crops will respond from all of these experiments. But let's start with the statistical models. They're very simple. So this is just one example that a colleague generously shared with me. This shows, it's Adams County in Illinois, and it shows data from 1981 to 2017. And the red line is temperature deviations, and it's a summer maximum temperature. And you can see these wiggles. They're going up and down from year to year. And the black line is annual yields of maize, in this case. And if you look at that, you can see that they're kind of anti-correlated, right? When one goes up, the other goes down. So in hot, when the summer Tmax is high, the yields are low. When the summer Tmax is low, yields are higher, and so on. So what statistical models do is essentially exploit that relationship. We know that when temperatures go up or go down, we expect yields to go up or go down. They've seen that over time. Then they can fit a model, essentially a statistical model, and then use that to project forward. So people have done that, and this is a study that came out of Stanford where they did this globally and using a statistical model estimated that just over the 1980 to 2008 period, we've experienced losses of maize yields by about 4% and wheat by about 5.5%. Lower losses for rice and soy. And so this is not saying that yields decreased. Over this time period, yields did go up, but it's saying that if climate change had not happened, we would have had higher yields by the same percentage, right? So climate change essentially decreased yields to be lower than what they might otherwise have been over this time period. So climate change is here, and it's already affecting crop production. So it's not something we are looking into the future. This has happened over the last 30 years. And if you look at that percentage loss for major producers, you find that the losses can be even higher. So Russia for wheat is estimated to have lost production by about 14%. Brazil and China for maize by 7 or 8%. Their estimate, China might actually have benefited in terms of rice production. And for soy, Paraguay and Brazil have had high yield losses, about 7.5% or so. This image now tries to, it's a similar image, but this study took all kinds of measurements. They said, okay, we have these soil warming measurements, we have crop models, we have statistical models, and so on, and they tried to put it all together into one picture. They said, what do we know from all of these different studies that are out there on how yields might respond? And so these are the kind of 5 different kinds of experiments or results that are out there, and they put it all there, and what they are estimating is how much yield loss would you expect per 1 degree Celsius increase in warming, okay? So if temperatures increase by 1 degree, how much would yields change? And they're finding similar results, that the bar here is the kind of what they call the average result from across all these models, and then you have the individual results here. So again, they're seeing wheat and maize yields to be most affected by, in this case, 6 to 7%, and as before, rice and soy less affected in terms of about 3% per warming. But you can also see there's disagreements. So in rice, there's a big disagreement. In maize as well, there's disagreements. But overall, you can get a sense that we might have this kind of order of magnitude losses with warming. Are these kinds of changes going to be gradual? This is just one study, very intriguing study that was done in the United States where they had access to kind of daily weather data and yields. And they found, they did the study for 3 different crops, for maize, cotton, and soy. But they found this, I'm just showing maize, that warming up to about 29 degrees Celsius might actually not change yields very much. But once you cross that threshold, there seems to be nonlinear decreases in yield. So when you're looking at yield growth over time, you may not see this, but they're finding in that in years when we've had really extreme weather events, that you have nonlinear responses of yields. Can farmers do something about it? Farmers are not passively, absorbing climate change. They're also doing something about it. And what can they do about it? This is a study that one of my former master's students did, where we simulated using one of these global models. This shows maize yields and estimated maize yield loss by 2050, and compared to a kind of a historical baseline. And we found that maize yields will decrease pretty much everywhere in the world, where we assume that farmers are passive and don't do anything. But then we did another simulation. In this model, we had the capacity of changing how farmers plant their crops or change their cultivars and so on. And so we assumed in this new simulation that farmers might change their planting dates as climate changes. We also assumed that the farmers might change their cultivars, the kinds of varieties they grow to suit the new climate. And when we did that, we found that a large part of northern temperate regions might actually increase in yields with climate change as farmers adapt. And in fact, when we put this all together, we found that large decreases in yields for maize, soy, and spring wheat without adaptation, but with adaptation, we could avoid a lot of those losses. I must say, when this study came out, people pointed out that this is kind of perfect adaptation. We don't expect this to happen, but you can kind of imagine this as sort of the upper bound of what could be possible. what's society doing to deal with this? Farmers can adapt. What are we doing? And at this point, I want to put a plug in for a study that I've just started, funded by Alberta Innovates, to look at climate change and crop production across the prairie provinces. So we've just started looking at that, and this is some preliminary results. So one of the things we've looked at is just looking at how yields have changed over the last 30 years, just looking at the data. One thing we found is that R&D dollars today are driven dramatically by private funding. So this private R&D dollars have gone up, that's the red, but public funding has actually gone down. And then the other thing we did was to just look at, okay, what did that do to yields? So here we're looking at yield changes for several crops, and this is the result for Canada. And looking at changes from 1975 to 2000, a 25-year period, and then since 2000 to 2017. And we found that private R&D crops have seen increases in yield growth, but it looks like for all the public crops like barley, wheat, and so on, yields seem to have stagnated. Yield growths have stagnated. So there seems to be clearly, a need for, increased investment in some of these crops that are quite important, like wheat. Okay, so this is taken you through a whole bunch of different results. This is a summary from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So every 5 years, as you know, the IPCC puts out a report, and they do an assessment of what do we know from the literature and what's happened, to climate change. So this is a fairly complicated figure. What they've done here is they've taken all the studies. You can see the dots there, right? There's lots and lots of dots. So there's like 120 dots here in orange. Each dot is a single study, and it's a study that looks at, that's used some kind of model to estimate how climate change will affect yields. And all they did in this study was to plot them all together and try to see if there are general patterns or trends in the data. So for example, for wheat, this is maize, wheat, and rice. The top is for temperate zones, the bottom is for the tropics. The bottom line message is that in the tropics, you're seeing large decreases in wheat yields, as well as maize yields, but not so affected in the temperate zones. So in the temperate zones are, as I mentioned before, might actually benefit in some cases. Then there are two different curves, the orange one and the blue one. The blue one is with adaptation, and the orange one is without adaptation. These are not really control studies because they've just thrown all the data sets together. It's not a, those in the audience who think about how to do science, they're not necessarily all controlled. In the paper, they did some additional controls, but generally speaking, they're finding that adaptation seems to alleviate some of the yield losses from climate change. Okay. So just to summarize all those results, wheat and maize seem to be most affected by climate change, and especially in the tropics. The temperate regions may actually benefit, especially with adaptation. There are possible nonlinear threshold effects, and this is still needs a lot more exploration. And that finally, adaptation, they estimate, can improve yields by about 7 to 15%. So that's what we know, but what about the things we don't know? So I'm going to briefly touch on what I call kind of known unknowns. So some things where we know that these things are going to matter, but we don't know a lot about them yet. So I'm going to look at extreme events and talk about pests, and I'm also going to talk about volatility a little bit. I can say that we know this is not a synthesis. This is sort of few studies. So with extreme events, this is a study where they just looked at what do we expect in terms of extreme events. So we know if you're a farmer, you're not thinking about gradual increases in temperature or changes in rainfall. It's a frost or a heat wave or a drought that matters, right? We know that. So what do we know about that? So this is an observational study that looked at how things have changed over the past, and they found that the probability of warm and dry conditions have doubled since 1931. So this shows warm year probability, and you can see the observations. The probability of warm year, increased warm years has gone up over almost pretty much everywhere in the world. Dry year probability hasn't changed very much, but the joint conditional probability that a year will be both warm and dry has also gone up. It's more than doubled. There are not that many studies that have asked, how extreme events would affect yields. It's quite challenging to do those studies for various reasons. One of my former students and I did a study where it's a fairly crude statistical study, but essentially we had data sets on extreme weather disasters. So there's a Belgian institute that basically compiles data. Every time there's a drought reported in the news or a heat wave or something, they record that data. So all we did was we took this data set of disasters. We also had data on yields, historical yields that were observed. And we just asked, using a statistical model, in years where we had these disasters, how do the yields compare to years that did not have disasters, okay? I won't go into details of how we did that, but this is a 7-year window, and what we have here is an average condition of years with the disaster and 3 years outside of that window where we did not have a disaster. And we found that with droughts, there was a 10% decrease in yields every time there was a drought, and a 9% decrease in yields, production, I should say, with extreme heat. We further asked, this is a global study, so we further asked, like, where do we expect these losses to be higher? And surprisingly, we found that the biggest losses were in this observational study was found in Europe, North America, and Australia, sort of the developed world, and less so in Africa and Asia. I don't want to read too much into these results. We have no idea why. This is a statistical result, but it was intriguing. What about pests? There's only one study I know of that's looked at this at the global scale recently, and they found that they developed a model to look at 2 different things that pests might do. One thing that pests do when it gets warmer is that their metabolic rate increases. They're more active. The other thing pests can do is that their population increases, so they are able to survive winters, for example, so their numbers increase. So there are 2 different outcomes that would happen. They put them together and they found that per degree increase in warming, you might increase pest-related losses by about 10 to 25%, different amounts for wheat, rice, and maize. These different curves show different assumptions in the model. What was more interesting is that they also expected that there will be more losses in temperate zones. So you think about it again. If in the tropics, as it gets hotter, pests might actually not be happy about that. In terms of metabolic rate, they're all active, but their survivorship, the pest population densities might actually decrease in the tropics according to this model, but it might actually increase a lot in the temperate zones, which also makes sense. So ironically, I've talked about so far about how crop production might actually benefit in the temperate zones from climate change, but so will the pests. So you have this effect where you have to not only look at how crop production might change, you also have to look at how their competitors will change. And there have been a lot of regional, local studies on how pests might respond to climate change. But this is one of the first kind of global results showing that we might actually have increased pest losses in the temperate zones. Finally, volatility in weather. This is kind of a huge, I would say, known unknown, in the sense that everyone talks about it, but I haven't seen very good ways of dealing with volatility and its impact on yields. It's very hard to know how when a heat wave happens or a drought happens, exactly how much has happened. But we have all these surprises, right? This is an article I found from the Narwhal. Another harvest from hell. Canada's farmers forced to acclimatize to weird weather. In late summer 2019, last year, 12 Manitoba counties declared agricultural emergency. It was too dry. At the same time, 2 Alberta counties also declared an emergency because it was too wet. They say in some counties it's starting to feel like weird weather is the new norm. And so when we think about climate change or global warming, we think about kind of gradual changes in weather. And in some ways, that's pretty easy to deal with. But some people are starting to use this term, global weirding, which is even harder to deal with, right? Like things are getting more weird. And we all know this from experience. Like anecdotally, we all talk about how this year it's been strange. It's never rained so much in July, or it's, this year has been too dry, or the snow came much earlier, and so on. And this is what farmers face on a day-to-day basis. Dealing with this, even if temperate regions, even if Canadian farmers might actually benefit from climate change, dealing with volatility is much more challenging. Now I want to switch and talk about agriculture as a solution and use that opportunity to take a drink. So what can we do about this? How can agriculture be part of the solution? If you followed if you're following the elections in the United States, you heard about the Green New Deal, and everyone's talking about regenerative agriculture and how agriculture is going to be part of the solution. We're going to sequester carbon, right? So this is now part of the conversation a lot. And if you read the literature or if you follow the media, there are lots and lots of solutions. People have their own favorite solution for how to deal with climate change. How should agriculture move forward? Should maybe switch to organic, or maybe support smallholders, go vegan, use GM as a solution, or maybe vertical farming. We can grow all our crops indoors, and then we don't have to deal with climate change. Maybe we should reduce waste. Some people say we should talk about food sovereignty because it's corporations that are the problem. So everyone has their opinions on this. Today I want to say, so a lot of my research has been to say, I don't want to be opinionated about these, but asking what do we know from kind of data? What does the data tell us on how each of these things might perform? So I'm going to touch on this idea of climate smart agriculture first. So if you want to deal with climate change, this is an idea that people have been talking about a lot, that we want climate smart agriculture, which will increase productivity and incomes of farmers. At the same time, it will mitigate climate change and it will increase resilience to climate change, right? So how do we do this, right? So there are, again, if you go back to those solutions, people might say that their favorite solution, GM, might be climate smart, or they might argue that organic is climate smart. So one of the things I wanted to do is to say, let's take 3 practices that people talk about a lot as being climate smart and ask what do we know. So I'm going to take conservation agriculture, organic, and smaller farms. I don't want to take a lot of time going through the research in detail, so what I've done for you is kind of an assessment based on a whole bunch of literature. So some from my own students and some from other people. So I'm going to take the kind of metrics for climate smart agriculture, that it's going to be productive, profitable, it mitigates climate change, and it makes agriculture more resilient to climate change. And ask from the literature, what do we know about those 3 practices: organic, conservation agriculture, and small farms. So this is a study that one of my PhD students did, where we assessed from the literature what do we know about organic agriculture. I'm not going to go through each row in gory detail, but I've colored them for you. You're finding that organic agriculture does have a problem with yield loss, that in general, organic agricultural yields are lower by about 20%. There is a lot of context dependency to this, that in some places we find the yield gaps are smaller, in some systems it's smaller, and so on. But on average, organic is less productive. It seems to be more profitable for farmers because they have a premium price once they've made the transition. It seems to be beneficial in climate mitigation. It's a little challenging. It reduces nitrous oxide emissions, but it increases methane emissions, but it also increases soil organic carbon by about 10%. And finally, another study showed that yield stability in organic is actually lower than in conventional agriculture. What about smaller farms? This is another study from one of my PhD students. He found that smaller farms are more productive, and I think that's a very well-known phenomenon. The agriculture economists have studied this for nearly 100 years, that they found that as farm size decreases, productivity seems to go up. We found, synthesizing the literature, about a 5% increase per decrease in farm size by 1 hectare. With profitability, we found that smaller farms are more profitable per unit hectare, but not at the household level. Households are less profitable. We didn't find any difference in greenhouse gas emissions. We didn't look at climate resilience in this case. Conservation agriculture is another interesting one. A study that was published in Nature several years ago found that conservation agriculture, conservation agriculture is where it's essentially 3 different practices. It's no-till, residue retention, having cover crops and so on, and using crop rotations. And so they found that no-till actually has a 6% impact on yields, lowers yields by about 6%. But in rain-fed dry regions, they found an increase in yield. It is profitable because farmers are now using less inputs. It's less costly for them. But there's no net change in soil organic carbon. One of the promises of conservation agriculture is that you're moving to no-till, is that you're increasing soil carbon. But when people have gone back and assessed these studies, they've been finding that it seems to be a redistribution of soil carbon from lower below to the surface. So it seems to increase soil carbon in the top layers, 0 to 10 centimeters. But below the plow depth of 25 centimeters, soil organic carbon seems to have decreased. So this is a study that Keith Paulson and others published recently. And what that same study has suggested that conservation agriculture could be climate resilient because as you're increasing soil organic carbon in the top layer, that can be beneficial to plants and how they deal with climate change. So here we looked at 3 different practices, and what we are finding is that not a single one of them has green across all 4 categories. And so the bottom line seems to be for me is like trade-offs, trade-offs, trade-offs. So the idea that we can have climate smart agriculture, which is simultaneously achieving all 4 of them, still seems to be not quite within our grasp. Every time we move to a different system, we gain something, but we lose something. So I think that's going to be one of our challenges looking forward. So I would like to propose or suggest, and this is where I'm switching a little bit from science towards opinion, but that instead of looking for a silver bullet, looking for a system like organic or smallholders or GM, that we should be considering a whole kind of plethora of different solutions. Somebody used the word silver buckshot, but I don't know whether like that. Not a silver bullet, but silver buckshot. But we should be thinking about different contexts, different crops, like what works and doesn't work. So conservation agriculture does seem to work in dry climates. So it seems to increase yields in dry climates and maybe also has climate resilience benefit. We should support organic agriculture in places where they work. Our study shows that they work well in rain-fed systems. They also seem to work well with legumes and perennials. We should support smallholders purely because, not because we think it's better for climate or anything, but there are a lot of them. A lot of the world has smallholders and they're poor. And purely from a kind of poverty alleviation point of view, we should be supporting smallholder agriculture. But broadly speaking, we should be identifying management practices for different crops, different systems, different regions, and so on. And my sense is that we shouldn't be focusing on one particular way of doing agriculture, but multiple ways of doing them. I'm also increasingly starting to, again, opinion, increasingly starting to embrace the idea of soft paths. I don't know if people know the term soft paths. In late 1970s, Amory Levins, who's an energy thinker, energy economist, energy thinker, came up with this idea of soft energy paths. And he was looking at the US energy system, and he realized that the way we deal with the energy crisis, energy problem is to produce more and more and more energy. It's kind of maybe the engineering mentality, which is if you have a demand, we supply it by producing more. And he was suggesting that that's not a great way of doing things, that maybe we should think about other ways of solving the problem by changing demand, improving efficiency, and so on. So he called it the soft energy paths. It's been quite influential. People in the water resource systems have also embraced it, and now there are papers on soft water paths. It essentially comes down to the idea that if you follow a soft path, and I don't have really a lot of time to go into it, is that if you improve efficiencies today, you're improving efficiencies for the future as well. And so it has this kind of double whammy effect. If your house has a leak, a leaky pipe, and so it means you're losing water, there are 2 ways of dealing with it. One is you get even more water to make up for the leak, or you fix the leak. And if you fix the leak, you use less water today, and you'll use less water in the future. That's a smarter way of dealing with it. So we can think about similar things with the food system as well. And I've started thinking like we can't just think about supply side solutions. We might also want to think about overall demand side solutions. And you heard this in the literature. People talk about more plant-based diets. Using crops for biofuels doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me, except in some cases. We might also want to think about improving efficiency both on the supply and the demand side, improving water and nutrient use efficiency, but also improving or reducing food loss and waste. It's estimated that 1/3 of the food that we produce with all of this energy and water and fertilizers is wasted. And then finally, sort of I sometimes say, make agriculture great again. It also stands for MAGA. But let's not pick particular solutions. What if your favorite solution is organic, agroecological, regenerative, or conservation agriculture? Let's make them all better. So if you're a farmer and you believe in organic agriculture, you know that you have a problem with yield gaps. Let's work on making that farm try to close the yield gaps. And if you're a farmer who's a conventional farmer, you might have environmental problems or excess nitrogen leaching. Deal with that problem. So instead of trying to push people to do a particular kind of farming, my sense is that we should push people to transition towards more sustainable agriculture, focusing on the metrics and not focusing on the ideology. I'm going to end with this slide. This is looking at delta O18, which is a measure for, it's kind of a proxy for temperatures over the last glacial period. Okay, so this is going back 100,000 years ago. And it shows a whole bunch of events like migration of humans out of Africa and arriving in Australia and so on. But this is the last 10,000 years, which we call the Holocene. And now some people are starting to call it the Anthropocene. It's a 10,000 year period when agriculture started, around 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. It's also when we had all our great civilizations. Civilizations flourished in the last 10,000 year period, partly because of agriculture. And if you look at the temperatures over this time period, we've been very fortunate. It's been fairly stable, right? So humanity developed, flourished over this 10,000 year period when climates were stable. But we think, talked about volatility, we think that that's not necessarily going to be the future looking forward, that we might have more unstable, volatile climate looking forward. So can we depend on a system? This system of agriculture that we have developed during this time period has been remarkably successful. But at least maybe we should be a little bit more humble in thinking forward and think about, if in a future volatile climate, we might want to think differently. We might want to think about systems, developing new systems that work for a volatile climate. Stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ramankutty. We will take time for a few questions and answers. Dr. Ramankutty has kindly consented to take some questions. So if you have any questions from the audience, please stand up and raise your hand. Any questions? Oh, compliant crowd. Here we go in the back, Sarah.
Yeah. So in this case, we took the crops that are where the cultivar development happens through private investment versus the crops where the development is funded mostly by government funding or kind of agriculture and agri-food Canada kind of funding, where the private firms are not putting in as much money. I will say that selection, we haven't been able to get data yet on exactly how many dollars are going to how many crops, which crops. So it was a crude guess based on knowing the crops which are mainly seeing investment. And that figure was only for Canada. But I would love to get that data if people actually have data on investments going into different kinds of crops.
Are there other questions? Yes.
Following up on that, looking at the privately invested versus publicly invested, which of those will be more important as an anchor to the smart agriculture systems that you're talking about?
It's a good question. So he's asking, sorry, I'll repeat the question. The question was looking at the privately versus publicly supported crops, which of those are going to be more important as an anchor to climate smart agriculture. So I mean, it depends on what the goals are. So the climate smart agriculture talks about being productive. It doesn't necessarily talk about feeding people. So it's focused on productivity and income. Those crops have different purposes. So wheat is a staple, and canola and what are the other crops there? You can go back. Soy, maize, and canola, I think, were the 3 crops that I had in that figure. Yep. Canola, corn, and soy. So they're not necessarily food crops. So these are definitely commercial crops and has benefits to farmers. So I think about the climate smart agriculture, I use the definition of climate smart agriculture that's commonly proposed, but we maybe also should be looking at expanding that definition to talk about what their purpose is, the value of those crops for farmers, but also for people. So in that sense, I would say ignoring wheat, which is a major crop in Canada from private, that's only publicly funded. I'm not arguing that we should switch private investment towards wheat. I'm kind of arguing that maybe we should increase public funding to some of these crops, yeah. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
I was wondering if you've considered reducing the demand on agriculture by working towards reducing the human population, or slowing the increase in human population, sort of leveling it off.
Yeah, I mean, there are multiple ways to think about that question, and one is the footprint, right? So people say it's a total consumption. The standard equation that people use is the iPad equation, that impact is population times affluence times technology. And so population is one side of this equation, the other side is consumption. And so we find that generally people, it's really hard to talk about population growth because even with low populations, people are consuming a lot more in some places than in other places. Population, I don't, on the other hand, population growth is something that, what shall I say? It is a problem for the overall impact. The way to address it is quite tricky. So when Paul Ehrlich talked about the population bomb a long time ago, a whole bunch of people started using it to talk about population control. In India, the country where I grew up, the son of the then prime minister went on a rampage trying to get people artificially sterilized. It lasted for about 2 or 3 weeks. So that's not the solution. But there's been lots of studies that show that empowering women, increasing women's education, providing access to family planning, et cetera, has huge impacts on population growth. Bangladesh, over the last 20 years, has reduced its fertility rate from about 6 to 2.1 now. So that's the kind of bright spots we should be looking at. They did it through a lot of providing access to healthcare and family planning and so on. Thanks.
Actually, I had one question I wanted to ask. I'll exert chair's prerogative. We recently had a campaign here that suggested that climate change would be good for Alberta agriculture. Is that a general observation one can make, or are there parts of the world where the effects of climate change might be much more adverse?
I think it came afterwards. I mean, the IPCC figure is probably the best summary of that. Sorry, I'm going to try to jump forward. Yeah. So, not talking about Canada in specific, but if you look at the temperate zones, the impacts of climate change are much smaller than what you would expect in the tropics. And so I think the broad consensus is that the temperate zones may not be affected as much by climate change. You still have impacts, but adaptation can possibly offset some of those impacts. This does not include the response of pests and diseases that I talked about, which might also increase in temperate zones. So these are kind of, in some ways, not fully comprehensive studies. It also does not include the influence of volatility, like things getting more weirder as weather gets more weirder. It's based on kind of studies that looked over kind of the recent history or using models. And so I would say, yes, there are two answers to this. Yes, Canada might actually benefit. A lot of integrated assessment models also show that the agriculture sector in Canada might be the only one, and maybe Russia as well, that might benefit from climate change. But that's not something that we necessarily should be happy about. I think we should be thinking about the equity problem. I think about climate change as a huge equity problem that Canadians have some of the highest per capita emissions on the planet. And so if we created the problem, we should fix it. So the problem that the tropics are facing are partly because of actions that we have taken over the historical past. So I think we also have a moral obligation to help the countries where it's going to be most worse off. Yeah?
Yes.
Or take it back.
Sorry. Sorry.
Sorry.
There's a question at the back.
I'll take a question from the back and then I'll come to you.
It would help me a lot to understand this figure if you could explain the variation and what those points are. The points for the temperate zones are all over the map.
Yeah.
I don't know what percentage of variance is explained by those regression pits, but it's very clear that if those are different years or different places, there's no prediction that works very well for anybody.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is, I'll answer one question first. So around the regression line, there is a kind of gray shaded area, and so that's the kind of their estimate of uncertainty. What they try to do in this figure is essentially try to do a meta-analysis of what is known. So this is a almost near identical figure into what went into the IPCC. The IPCC has a mandate that says, assess what's happened. And so this is the figure they produce, and that's what I showed. But in that paper by Challenor, they do a kind of more controlled model where they took only paired studies where, that they had both adaptation and no adaptation, and they ran models trying to control for a bunch of things. And they found broadly similar results. There are some differences, but they found broadly similar results. I totally agree with you that this is a smorgasbord of different data points. Then you're looking at, across these studies, are there any general patterns or not? And I think they argue in that paper that there are some general patterns.
Is that spatial variation or temporal variation?
It's both. So this is all studies that they assess. So it's from different regions, different places, different time periods. Yeah. They just threw it all into the pot and say. Yeah.
Sorry, there was another question in the middle?
There was another question here before. But
Was there?
did you? Yeah.
On that temperate zone variability, do I understand there's a theory kind of going back to your map where the increased temperature is up in the high Arctic, saying that you get in the temperate zones, you might be getting a lot more warming in the north. That decreases the temperature differential between the polar regions and the north, slows down the jet stream starts to wobble.
Yeah.
And then, even though on average we don't do bad, we get hammered by these jet stream loops that will give us cold or floods or, in other
Yeah.
words, that we get hammered by variation that the tropics don't get.
Yeah.
Have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I'm I would say, passive recipient of those theories. I don't work in climate science anymore. But it makes complete sense. So as the Arctic gets warmer because of sea ice feedback, the gradient between the tropics and the Arctic is decreasing, and you would expect. So it's the gradient. The general circulation of the atmosphere is because of those gradients. The reason we have our Hadley cells and Ferrel cells and all that. So the expectation would be indeed that the jet stream would become more wobbly. And that it would, so not only is it getting more wiggly, but it's also going to move slower. And so what we are seeing, so the whole polar vortex that people have been talking about is essentially that phenomenon. And so we end up having a wobblier jet stream, so we have more Arctic air coming south, but then it sits there for a week or 2 weeks before it moves on. And same thing happens when you have a warming event. So yeah, so you're absolutely right. So the climate model predictions of just kind of gradual warming, now we have to deal with this kind of volatility changes. Yeah.
Okay.
Your very last slide that you ended with, the right-hand scale, was that degrees centigrade? The very last slide?
What was the very last slide? Oh, the very, very last slide. It was a measurement of delta 018, so it wasn't converted into degrees centigrade. It's a proxy for temperatures. Yeah.
Are there other questions? Yes.
So can you give us a general overview of your basically talk about incorporation of biodiversity into impact assessment?
Can I give a?
The table that you had for different solutions.
Yeah.
It was greenhouse gas emission, but there was nothing about biodiversity.
Yeah.
So can you give us some background of where we are at in terms of incorporation of biodiversity into our impact assessment?
Yeah, great question. So the question was about the table that I showed did not have biodiversity in it. I was using climate smart agriculture framework, which doesn't talk about biodiversity. In other talks, I talk about biodiversity and how different farms. So how do I answer your question? There are lots and lots of studies that look at the impact of agriculture on biodiversity and different kinds of farming practices on biodiversity. So the one I'm most familiar with is organic agriculture. And there's a lot of evidence that organic agriculture per unit area, so if you're comparing a conventional farm and an organic farm next to each other, per unit area, organic agriculture does seem to have higher biodiversity, more species richness and increased abundance, but the yields are lower. So there's a funny kind of disciplinary problem in the kind of experiments. So people who go and do comparative experiments, when they're agronomists, they often measure yields, they don't measure biodiversity. Ecologists often go and measure biodiversity, they don't measure yields. And so there are only a few studies that have measured both of them, and they find typically that there's a trade-off. So when they control for yields, they find that the biodiversity benefit of organic disappears. So organic per unit area seems to have a lot of benefits. As soon as you control for the yield loss, those benefits diminish. And so that's a big problem, closing the yield gaps.
Yeah, whenever you talk about global warming, the temperature, but it may affect also the rainfall,
Yes.
total amount and distribution.
Yeah.
So that you include that rainfall in your model?
Yeah, so a lot of these models include both temperature and rainfall in their predictions. The temperature effect is much stronger because it's much more consistent. The rainfall effect, because it increases in some places and decreases in some places, the yield impact is, on a global scale, is averaged out. And different models predict different things. In some places, some models predict increases in rainfall, some predict decreases. So it's not as consistent a prediction. But generally speaking, there are a few things that we know will happen, which is there'll be an increased acceleration of the hydrological cycles. So they do expect that rainfall intensity will increase, and that increased so your rain might come in more heavy rains. And that's not necessarily good for crops either. And so even if average rainfall goes up, if they're causing floods all the time, that's not good. So there's a lot more work to be done, I would say, in kind of looking at kind of the extremes, like not just the means, but the distribution of how rainfall is going to change. Yeah.
Oh, there's one more. All right, we'll take one more question. Thank you. I know what I want to ask, but I'm not sure how I want to ask it. Do you know if the models for the temperate areas take, is it just the daytime temperature, or is there day and nighttime temperature? So over the last 100 years in Alberta, the average daytime temperature in summer has been trending down with fewer days over 30 degrees.
Mm.
Which is really good for agriculture. And at the same time, the nighttime temperature has been moving up. So the increase in temperature that we've seen
Yeah.
type of bird where we see the temperature changes
Yeah.
are kind of a double benefit.
Yeah.
Do you know if the models incorporate that?
Yeah, so most of the models, you look at both Tmax and Tmin, that increases in temperatures. The models show that rice will, like maize and wheat are more affected by temperature increases than rice and soy. And there's pretty good evidence that the reason that rice seems to benefit is because of increases in minimum temperature, because most rice flowers in the mornings apparently, and so increases in warming, increases in minimum temperature is beneficial for rice. So having said that, I mean, there are studies, a good study should do that. I'm not saying that all studies have done that. Yeah.
Okay, if there are any more questions for the speaker, please talk to him after we've cleared out. He'll be glad to talk with you. Before we go, I'd like to offer a little gift, a speaker's gift from the department. I should emphasize it's more of a nominal gift, but a gift nonetheless. I would also like to thank the people who helped us put this presentation on, particularly Rihanna Bennett for administrative support, Sarah Gooding for financial accounting support, and Mike Abley for technical support. These are all people that really help us put these shows on. Now, we do have a reception in the Agriculture and Forestry Atrium, which you can get to by exiting out the north door of this building, the ground floor, north door, and you're walking past the Butterdome, and you'll find the Ag 4 building a little bit on to your left. We will lead the way. It is a hosted reception, so you're welcome to join us for as long as our hospitality lasts. And come and see the posters, which will be put up there, and come and meet some of the faculty, come and talk with Dr. Ramankutty, and otherwise enjoy yourselves. We will see you in the atrium.